Hey everyone, I'm Alexa. I was previously the director of marketing at Keen.io, which was based out of Heavybit quite a long time ago. It's an analytics tool for developers. Now working on something completely new in the mental health space, but open source was a big part of our business and marketing strategy at Keen, so I'm super excited to be here with Peter Reinhardt, the CEO and founder of Segment. We're going to dive in a little bit into how AnalyticsJS, one of their open source projects, played a big role in them finding product market fit. And then for those of you that don't know, Segment is a customer data platform with over 15,000 customers. They've raised over 100 million and they're doing quite well. And so I'll kick it over to Peter to just kind of open up, tell us a little bit about yourself and the journey from AnalyticsJS to Segment.
Yeah, so I grew up in Seattle and then went off to study aerospace engineering at MIT. And so you might be wondering, how does an aerospace engineer end up at a software company or running a software company? And the short answer is that my roommates at MIT were both in the computer science department. And we decided in our junior year that we really wanted to start a company together. And so we applied to Y Combinator with this idea to build a classroom lecture tool. So the idea was to give students this button to push to say, I'm confused, and the professor would see this graph over time of how confused the students were. And so I might have this graph up here right now. And a bunch of professors were really excited about it. We got into Y Combinator with this idea, raised about 600K coming out of demo day, and we were really excited about it. We put it in a bunch of classrooms in Boston in the fall, as the fall semester got going in September 2011, and it was a total disaster. Basically, all the students opened their laptops and they all just went straight to Facebook. And this was horrifying because we had literally just gotten the checks from our investors. And so we had to go through the painful process of calling back all our investors and explaining to them that this was a terrible idea. And basically decided that we wanted to pivot into being an analytics company. And so we tried to build a competitor to Mixpanel or Google Analytics or Kissmetrics or Keen. And it turns out this is a really hard market to build a product in. There are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of analytics tools. And so it's really difficult to differentiate. And without a differentiated sort of value, it's really hard to make any money. And so about a year after that first failure, we still didn't have any paying customers of our analytics tool, Segment.io. And so that was a pretty tough point for us. That was December 2012. And if you sort of pause there, rewind back to the very first week of Y Combinator, we had been like, well, we should have analytics on our classroom lecture tool. And so we Googled it, and we found Google Analytics, Kissmetrics, and Mixpanel. And we're trying to figure out how to install these different tools, or trying to figure out which one to use. And we basically noticed that they all collect the same data. And we couldn't figure out which one was going to be better than any of the others. And so we decided to build a little abstraction that could basically take in the sort of common user data that all of these tools needed, and then could translate and fan that data out to all those tools downstream. And so we built this little wrapper, called it AnalyticsJS, and then we set it aside and kept working on our classroom lecture tool. Then it got cleaned, this little library got cleaned up a little bit. 4 months later, it got cleaned up a little bit more. 4 months later, cleaned up a little bit more. And by this time, we were trying to sell our own analytics product, and we kept encountering this objection in the sales process, which was, well, I already have Mixpanel installed, or I already have Google Analytics installed, or I already have Keen installed. And then my co-founder, Ilya, had this really good idea. He's like, what if we took that little library that could send data to those 3 tools, and we added ourselves as the 4th tool that it could send data to? And so every time we encounter that objection, we'll just send them this library, and then they'll be able to send the data everywhere. And so we started using this. We started sending it out to customers. They started installing it, starring it on GitHub, submitting pull requests, things like that. And so a few more months went by. We started to realize that our analytics tool was still going to fail because the people who were using this little library were still not using our analytics tool. So they were just sending data to these other tools. And so finally, we get to December 2012. We realize that our analytics tool has failed. We have about 100K left of our 600K in funding. And we get to this decision point of, what are we going to do with the final 100K? What's our final attempt to build a company here? And my co-founder, Ian, was like, you know what? I think there's a big business behind AnalyticsJS, this open source library. And I was like, that is literally the worst idea I've ever heard. Like, it's 500 lines of code, it's already open source. Like, explain to me the business proposition behind this library. And so we fought about it all day long, and I went home and I was like racking my brains, like, how do I kill this idea? And came in the next day, and I was like, all right, guys, here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a beautiful landing page. It's really going to pitch the value of AnalyticsJS, this open source library, and we're going to put it up on Hacker News, and we're just going to see what happens. And I'm thinking, like, this will totally kill it, and it'll prove to them that there's like no good idea here, because nothing ever gets voted up on Hacker News. And so we did that, and much to my surprise, it went straight to the top. Got about 300 upvotes on Hacker News, got a few thousand stars on GitHub, a few thousand email signups. People were like reaching out to us on LinkedIn demanding access to a hosted version beta that we said existed but didn't. So that open source library sort of launched the company, if you will. And so I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that.
Just
Sorry
to
for
get
the
a
long
quick
intro.
Yeah, no, it's great. Just to get a quick show of hands, how many of you have either built something open source related to your product or considering it currently? So a lot of you. That's great. That's probably why you're at this talk. So Peter, could you tell us a little bit more about how both Segment and that initial community around AnalyticsJS has evolved over time, and why?
Yeah, so frankly, most of the community interest happened in the first like 48 hours, where we basically went from 20 stars on GitHub to about 1,500 stars on GitHub. And the cool thing was it was sort of a, the Hacker News community sort of validated the idea first and foremost. They could go and trawl through the code and say like, okay, this is abstracted well. This is like well-written code. It's clean. This is something that I would want to put on my site. Like, I feel confident in the engineering behind this library. And so a lot of the sort of initial value of the AnalyticsJS community was just in validating that this was the right way to build a solution to a real problem. And frankly, since then, the library has continued to get sort of a steady stream of attention, but even today it's at like 3,800 stars, just to give you a sense. So it's not like in the last 5 years it's like gone on some exponential curve in terms of interest in it. It was really sort of an initial spike and then a long, slow rise. Unlike other open source libraries where the open source library really contains most of the value, AnalyticsJS is a little bit unique in that it doesn't totally solve the problem that developers have. And so you really need a hosted version in order to solve that problem. And so the library has continued to be sort of a lead gen source for us, if you will. I think it gets about 7,500 page views a day on GitHub. And the community, I think, has been really helpful in issuing pull requests and occasional things to sort of flesh it out over time. But really, almost all the interest happened in sort of this bang at about 48 hours right at the very beginning.
So you had that initial interest, and a lot of that early community has contributed to your success in some way, but did you build out a funnel to continue to support and grow that, or was it more of an emergent outcome?
Yeah, it was more of an emergent outcome. I think there are other open source libraries, like say a database, where like you sort of have to open source the entire database in order for someone to give it a try. AnalyticsJS is a little different because you can sort of see it and inspect all the code because it's only like 500 lines. But in order to actually use it, you need to like deploy it to a CDN. And then when a marketer wants to update one of the integrations to send data to a new tool, then like you need to recompile the library and redeploy it to the CDN. And so it's different in the sense that like there's a lot of heavy lifting there that an engineer has to do to actually use the library, but they don't really want to do. And so that sort of very naturally becomes the genesis of a hosted version where a marketer can push a button and our hosted version of the library changes automatically. I think there's like something unique structurally about it as an open source library that makes it really amenable to driving traffic in sort of a funnel towards a hosted version of a product. Yeah, so it looked like a lot of people in this room are either considering an open source strategy or already have one. Do you think what happened with Segment AnalyticsJS is a repeatable, reproducible strategy that other founders and engineers hoping to build out successful paid hosted developer products could replicate, and should they follow that? Yeah, I think I was thinking about this a little bit. There's a really good blog post. How many of you know Tom Tunga's, the blog? Okay, there's a lot of hands there. Good, so he had this article recently. I think he was like reflecting on the past year and how like almost every company is really kind of a special snowflake. And I think it's a really good observation that like most companies really are pretty unique in like a lot of ways when it comes to like the core product strategy. So I worry a little bit that there's something structurally about AnalyticsJS which is not reproducible, or at least not reproducible on purpose. Maybe to be a little bit more helpful, I think what's interesting about AnalyticsJS is it was sort of a minimum testable product in the sense that it tested some of the assumptions of like, is there value to be delivered here? And is that something that people are interested in? But it was not sort of the actual thing that people would want to buy, which I think is different from a lot of other open source projects where it's really basically the entire kit and caboodle and you can do everything with it, except maybe there's like a few features that are blocked off around the edges. There's a really famous or well-known diagram of like what a minimum viable product looks like. And they show like what it's not, which is like 2 axles with wheels on either side that are just like disconnected and some bolts lying around. Like that's not a minimum testable product because no one can actually go try it. And I think that's not what AnalyticsJS was. AnalyticsJS was much more like the other diagram which you may have seen, which is like a Razor scooter with like a vision bubble of like a car. AnalyticsJS could basically provide some value and really test that assumption, but could not really solve the entire enterprise problem that we now address through a hosted service with like data governance and data sources from other places like Stripe and Salesforce and Zendesk, collecting data from mobile and so on. So I think if there's some way that you can use open source to test the demand for a product or test this sort of like minimum viable thing, then it can be a really good way to sort of build a fanatical set of users that really go deep in understanding and contributing back to what problem you're trying to solve for them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I want to touch a bit on some of the theoretical approaches to open source from a business perspective. I think it was a past speaker series talk here at Heavybit. MySQL Martin Micos was saying how there's basically 2 main open source approaches. There's the foundational approaches where you have like an Eclipse or a Mozilla Foundation type model. And then there are one where the company and the actual open source project are one and the same. So something like MongoDB or JBoss. Do you agree with that kind of assessment, or do you have different opinions?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that assessment. I think there aren't that many successful truly open source models for like how to build a company around a product that is really truly open source. And we sort of looked at that early on. Like this is one of the reasons why I didn't think AnalyticsJS was a good idea. Because if you look at those 2 models and you look at AnalyticsJS, it's not complicated enough to have like the JBoss or Red Hat model where you like provide support around some really complicated system that needs to be run in production. And it doesn't really fit the other model either of a consumer product that has ads or other things baked into it. So like, those are really the only models that have been proven out for open source, and AnalyticsJS didn't fit either of those. And so I'd say actually it was very purposeful on our part to sort of pivot out of being an open source company. It's certainly where we came from. We still open source a lot of things. I think we have maybe 1,000 or 2,000 open source repos, some of which have more stars than others. But we very much sort of pivoted out of that on purpose towards a real business model that we felt had legs.
I agree with you as well. Like, given that that's something that's worked for a lot of companies, kind of use open source to do that initial test, build that seed community, figure out if there's product market fit and validate that, and then shifting your focus to a more hosted and paid business model. What early indicators did you look for as signal that that was something that was working?
So the biggest signal, I think, was that there were, first of all, thousands of signups for the hosted product. And then we hired a scraping company. This is sort of a unique aspect of having a JavaScript library that gets deployed on websites. We hired a scraping company called Grepser, and they just scraped the top 1,000,000 sites, and we do this like once or twice a year. And they would tell us how many of the top 1,000,000 sites were using the open source version of the library. It is shockingly small compared to the hosted version. So it was pretty apparent from early on that like a very, very, very small number of like hardcore engineers actually want to use the open source library, and everyone else wants to use the much easier hosted version. Other systems that are maybe deployed in server backends or other things would be way harder to measure, like how many people are using the open source thing versus a hosted service.
Yeah.
But we were lucky in the sense that AnalyticsJS could be detected.
Yeah. So as founders that are kind of navigating that decision, like go open source first, test product market fit, or just build out the hosted version and try to test that, what would you recommend?
I think if there is a natural way to build a small open source library that tests product market fit, then I'd totally do it. Like, you're going to get a sort of fanatical developer community that's like excited about the fact that it's open source. They're going to like issue pull requests. They're going to give you lots of feedback. You're going to get more feedback than you want, probably. So I think it can be a really, really valuable strategy. But if it's not natural, then I wouldn't force it.
Okay. So obviously we know what happened with Segment. You guys are super successful. You landed on a SaaS business model versus a fully open source model. I'm curious, did you ever consider boss foundations or vendors in your early business decision making, or was the primary focus always on the contributors and the users?
Sorry, what do you mean by a FOSS foundation?
So open source software, like free open source software foundations and vendors.
Oh,
like
just like
free
going
versus,
the model of just offering the entire thing for free?
And then operating more on like a support based.
I don't think we would have solved people's problem that way. So we were like most interested in helping companies solve the sort of underlying problem, which was like, how do I get my data out of all these systems into all these other systems? There are some open source, like truly open source products that help people do that, and they just don't have that broad of adoption. And I think it's because there's enough complexity in setting it up and maintaining it in your own data center or your own cloud that it doesn't really solve people's problems. And so I think in order to actually build something that solves the underlying problem for companies, you actually have to go all the way to a hosted service.
Okay.
So I guess sort of we considered it, but it wasn't a natural way to help people.
So you obviously started with the JavaScript community. People here might be working in the JavaScript community or other communities and language communities. How do you think the JavaScript community might be different from other types of open source communities? And what are the nuances that make that easier or harder when you're initially starting out and marketing a product?
Yeah, I think probably everyone here who pays attention to the JavaScript community has seen that it like turns over in its entire set of libraries about like once every 6 months. So like it means that everyone is really, really fast to adopt new things, which means that everyone is eager to test out the latest and greatest or most interesting new thing. So I think that's a really big benefit of building a library in that ecosystem, in the sense that you're going to get a lot of early usage and people banging on things to see what works. There are definitely other communities, like my father-in-law is a physicist at UCSB. They program in Fortran. Like that community is not an early adopter of new libraries. What
were some of the early challenges of this approach, and how did you solve for them?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is when you're coming from the open source world and sort of shifting into the business world, you have this sort of mentality that like things are free, or at least that your ground assumption for building a product is that your product is free. And I think that's actually pretty bad as far as trying to build a company, because you're not really grounded on the value that you're providing. You're just grounded on the fact that you offered it for free at some point. And so I think, especially for us coming from the MIT community originally, where there's a really strong free, like software should be free, from Richard Stallman is like a sort of cultural aspect of the MIT community. We were really, really averse to asking people for money for the service that we were providing. And it actually took a sales advisor sort of grinding us down to get us to understand that it was okay to ask companies to pay money to use this service that was providing them value. And basically, all this guy did, which was amazing, he basically sat me down right before we went into one of my first sales meetings with him, and he said, "Peter, you have to ask for $120,000 a year." And I was like, "Holy shit, are you kidding me?" Like, at the time we were charging maybe $120 a year for using AnalyticsJS, the hosted version, and he's like, "No, you have to ask for $120K." And so I asked for $120K, and I got argued down to $18K a year, which was pretty embarrassing. But nonetheless, that was 150x what we had previously been charging, right? So he got whatever 80% off, and I got 150x. So I think I was like constantly surprised by how much people were willing to pay, which was basically an estimation of how much value I felt they were actually getting out of it. And so as we got more and more confident about asking for those prices, within 5 months of these, of asking people for this amount of money, we were getting 120K a year on some deals. And so I think making the shift in your pricing estimate from free open source to what a real enterprise software company needs to ask for is a pretty tough transition mentally.
kind of going back to the beginning to round this out before we open it up for questions from the room, are there things you do differently now that you have the hindsight looking back? When you had that 600K, you were 100K left, you did this open source thing. What would you do differently, if anything?
Would do so many things differently. The first was it just took us a really long time to figure out what product market fit would feel like. I don't know exactly what stage your companies are at, but we spent a year and a half basically searching for product market fit when it probably should have taken us about 6 months. I was always really impressed and inspired by the guys from Codecademy, the online learning to code thing. I think they went through like 12 product ideas in like 8 weeks, and they like legitimately tested all of them. And like it took us a year and a half to do 3. And like literally Codecademy was created like 4 days before Y Combinator demo day. And in those 4 days, they actually found product market fit because they iterated so many times, and they grew from like 0 to 300,000 users in 4 days, and then had the most amazing demo day of all time. So I think there's something to be said for just the pace of testing new ideas that we were really bad at.
Yeah, getting one last question for everyone up personally, what was holding you back from kind of testing more quickly at the time? Was it stubbornness around no, this is going to work, we're going to keep going, or was it fear?
It's stubbornness and the tricking yourself into believing that someone saying like, oh, that's cool, is like validation of the idea. Everyone wants to be nice to you, and it's like very easy to trick yourself into believing like, yeah, there's real product market fit here, and then you just waste like 6 months chasing ghosts.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much. That was great. I'd like to open it up to the audience if you all have questions to ask Peter.
About 48 hours. So, so we launched AnalyticsJS, and it like went whoop, and then on Hacker News, we got all these email signups, and then we sat down the next day, and we were like, okay, like what does this mean? And we're like, well, like clearly there's product market fit for something here. Clearly there's demand for the hosted version because people were like literally reaching out to us on LinkedIn. I have a screenshot of this guy who's now faculty at MIT. He reached out and said, what does a brother have to do to get access to this beta? I will tolerate bugs like you wouldn't believe. It's like, okay, like clearly we should, it was not ambiguous at all. And so AnalyticsJS launched on December 12th, 2012. And then we basically immediately the next day started working on the hosted version because we said it existed and it didn't. And we built it in 5 days and launched it on December 17th. And then we just focused entirely on that. The weird thing with AnalyticsJS was that it got all this star attention, got like all these people who were like excitedly chatting about it. I would be willing to bet that no more than 500 people have ever actually used open source AnalyticsJS in production. Like it's not a large, like way more people have used the hosted version. So I like by the end of December 2012, like it was like the hosted version was launched so soon after, and it was so much easier to use that just like everyone just cut over to that. So like by December 30th, or by the end of that December, we had 70 companies sending data through the hosted version. Off of the beta list of a few thousand signups. So it was like very, very fast.
And were you charging them at that point for the hosted version?
Oh God,
or
no. We were terrified of charging
no?
people.
Okay. Because I was going to say, like, for when developers are evaluating like something that's free versus paid, and they're like, well, it's free and I can just do it myself, I'll do that. But if both were free and that was easier,
it took us like 10 months maybe until we decided to ask people to pay money. Like we were terrified of this. We literally wrote, I have them all, we wrote handwritten emails like apologizing to people that we were going to ask them for money. Like I can't overstate how afraid we were of asking people for money.
But it was worth it.
Yeah.
Once you finally did it.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you advise people ask for money a lot sooner?
From day one, yeah.
What have you learned about adoption from small companies versus large companies that can pay per segment?
So the way that we get into these companies or into all companies is pretty similar. But the willingness to pay and the reasons why we get into those companies are a little bit different. So in really small companies, like say less than 20 people, we only really get in if they're investing for the future, because a really small company doesn't use that many tools. They have like an analytics tool and maybe an email marketing tool, and like you can kind of just install those directly yourself. But if you are a small startup and you're looking ahead to like where you're going to have also a bunch of ad pixels and you're going to have a whole bunch of other data sources, then like you might invest in installing Segment or AnalyticsJS early on. So they're sort of like startups are a unique beast because they, in terms of our market, because they need to be expecting this growth curve for it to make sense for them. But even there, we get in through developers. So developers who are like, oh, this is the right way to do it. Like we should just use Segment. In sort of SMB world, which is call it like 20 people to like 200, we still come in through a developer, but then it tends to sort of percolate up through the organization until you get to the VP of engineering or the CTO. And then they're the person who actually buys it. And basically they're doing it because the marketer, the CMO or VP marketing is like constantly pestering them and saying like, I need this tool, I need this tool, I need this tool. And at some point the VP of engineering throws up their hands and is like, this is ridiculous. Like, we need a better solution. And then an engineer is like, ooh, I know. And then in the mid-market and enterprise, the same thing tends to happen in a business unit, but then there's like a different complicated mechanism by which we spread across business units and up inside the organization. I think we were looking at AnalyticsJS, and we're looking at just like how complicated is AnalyticsJS, and it's just like, it's not that complicated. Like, I mean, it really is like 1,000 lines of code. And so if we just provided service for that, like it was a little bit unclear like what service we would be providing. Like how would we, like what would we do? And then we were sort of talking with people about like what problems were in the way of them actually using the library, which is sort of what services would you offer? And it was entirely like, can you host it on a CDN for me? And so then that naturally flows into a SaaS model as opposed to naturally flowing into like, well, this thing is so complicated, like we can configure it for you. You know, like that would maybe go more towards a services model, like Red Hat. But so it's sort of the product sort of forces the split there, as opposed to it being like a really cerebral decision. Yeah, so I think it's only important to us insofar as we sell through developers, right? And if you're a developer, you want to like, and you're about to put this JavaScript library on your page, like you want to know, like, is it a good API? Is it well constructed? Is it going to crash my page? Like, you want to just understand the like technical inner workings of this thing that you're about to add to your code base. So I think from that perspective, it's been really important and critical for it to be open source and be visible and understandable throughout all of our sales processes, because when someone we're selling into, even a large company, and they're like, oh, well, like, how does your code work? Because they're used to a bunch of terrible vendors that have APIs that are always crashing. And we're like, oh, well, here's our library. It's open source. Check it out. And the engineers are like, oh, man, 2 thumbs up. Like, this is great. And so all of a sudden you get this buy-in at this really important layer in the company and really accelerates growth. So I think it's been very important, even though no one uses it, which is weird. Yeah, so I'd say we have 2 moments in the company where the pricing has really dramatically changed. So the first moment was the one that I described earlier, where this sales advisor was just like, ask for more, ask for more. And really that was just value-based. Like there was no rhyme or reason to it. Like we'd just go into a company and we'd say like, well, you know, given your volume, like here's our price. And we just throw out whatever, like, because we had no idea. Like we didn't know if we could charge people $1 million or only $100 for it. And the only way to find out was to come up with some fabricated reason for the price that you were presenting. So that was just like pretty shoot from the hip, testing the waters on value. Later, so more recently, like maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, we made a much more like thoughtful, concerted structural change to our pricing, which was to switch from API calls, so like how many pieces of data are you sending through Segment, to how many users are you tracking through Segment. And that was like a much more thoughtful, analyzed, like we hired a pricing consultancy firm to come in and run user surveys and then compile all that data, and then we ran some experiments. That was like a much more concerted effort and was also very successful. Like doubled revenue growth rate basically. So I lost track of your original question, but like pricing is super impactful, and early on I think you're just trying to understand the value. Yeah, I think this is a big problem for a lot of open source projects and associated companies. It's not a problem for AnalyticsJS, and it's not because we came up with some clever hack there. It's just because of the structure of the library is like no one wants to host it on their own CDN. So yeah, I don't know if there's like magic there, but yeah, we don't really encounter that. Yeah, for better or worse, we didn't really think that much about it, and we just made everything MIT licensed, which is like a very permissive license. And like once it's out there as MIT license, like you don't really take it back. I mean, it would be a really bad thing to take it back. So pretty much all of our libraries are MIT licensed. And it's interesting because we have actually one competitor that literally they take our open source library and use it as their product. So like it has that downside, I guess, that like people can just compete with you on it. Like there's no anti-competitive terms or anything in the license. It's very permissive. On the flip side, I don't know how a company like that really attracts talent when they aren't even using their own code. So anyways, I think it sort of works out in the end, but yeah, we've never really thought long and hard about what the licenses are that our stuff is open sourced under. We probably should have. Yeah, the question is, do we have external contributors not coming from Segment? Definitely, yeah. On AnalyticsJS, I think there's probably, I would guess 100 external contributors. Although basically the library is sort of in like a pretty polished state, and so there's not a lot of activity on it now. But yeah, from the early days, there's probably a lot.
Thank you all for your questions and your attention. From my perspective, being in the analytics industry for the last 3 years, it's been really fun to watch Segment's growth and success. I'm going to close it off with like a more general question. What advice would you have for early stage founders in general, or ones that are considering kind of using open source as that initial product market fit validation strategy?
I guess I would just say you can probably spend a really long time chasing your tail searching for product market fit. So I would be very, very careful about how you think about and understand whether you have product market fit. And if you don't, be really, really honest with yourself about it. Otherwise, you can waste a big chunk of your life searching for something that isn't there. So really, really focus on finding product market fit. That'd be my main recommendation.
Thanks. Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.